Welcome to Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Canan, and we are broadcasting live on September 10th from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. And I want to thank everyone, all the donors who contributed during the last week on WMNF. Tuesday Cafe made its goal thanks to the generosity of people like Leslie and Joe and Barbara and David and some others. WMNF still has a bit more to raise, so please make a contribution if you can at WMNF.org. And we're kicking off this show talking about a Florida election police. Sorry about that. They have been questioning people in their homes about petitions they signed to get Florida's abortion rights amendment on the ballot. And our guest to talk about this is Justin Garcia. He's the Tampa Bay Times state and local accountability reporter. His focus is on law enforcement and the judicial system. And I want to welcome you back to Tuesday Cafe, Justin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So we're going to back it up a little bit before this story. So just tell us, what is Amendment 4 and how did it get on the ballot?
So Amendment 4 would essentially bring back abortion rights to the state of Florida and give women control of their decision-making and what to do with their bodies. And that it would essentially negate Ron DeSantis' 6-week abortion ban that was enacted earlier this year. And it got on the ballot because enough petition signatures were gathered by different groups in order to put it on November's ballot this year.
And we'll be talking in this interview about some of those petition signatures, but we'll back up, even continue backing up here. And it seems like the DeSantis administration is unleashing the apparatus of the state here to oppose this amendment. One example that, we're going to talk about, you're reporting on how it's investigating whether there were fraudulent signatures. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's talk first about this thing we learned about a little bit earlier, which is there's a website by the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration that opposes Amendment 4. What do you know about that?
Yeah, well, that was my colleague, Romy, who wrote that story, and it's about the state essentially using taxpayer funds to use this website to promote Ron DeSantis' belief about abortion. But I would like to back up even a little before that, because this all kind of started last week when I received some information, because now, as well as focusing on law enforcement and the judicial system, I've also been tasked until November with covering election integrity. And so this whole kind of thread of stories started last week when I received a tip from a supervisor of elections from somebody who's associated with different supervisor of elections offices. And they came to me and basically said that Ron DeSantis or the State Department, which works for Ron DeSantis, was requesting thousands of petitions, specifically to look at the signatures on those petitions in order to scrutinize them and see if they are actually valid petition signatures. And so that was early last week that we received that information, verified it with, I think, 4 different counties for our first story. Orange County, here in Hillsborough County, the Department of State had requested nearly 7,000 petitions. And in Palm Beach County, they requested to review the most over there, and that was about 17,000 of the petitions. And the supervisor there told me that was about 150 hours of work for her office. And even the people who were requesting this from the Department of State were saying, we understand that this is a lot of work. And it is an election season too, right? So that's how this whole chain of stories started, as we found out that they were requesting, upwards of like 36,000 petitions from these different counties around the state, and then hearing from them that this is going to be quite the task to go through. A lot of these are on paper, right? So they have to go through these boxes and go and find the petitions and the circulators they're talking about, so that way they can look at them and kind of scrutinize them as they're doing now.
And I should point out that, unless I'm mistaken, it's not like these signatures and these forms hadn't been looked at before and they were just counted automatically. These were the ones that were considered to be valid. Isn't that right?
Yes, exactly. There was already this review process earlier in the year, and that's already taken place. So they're specifically looking at these signatures that were counted as valid already. So that's something that some people have pointed out in the process of this story coming out is, it's highly unusual that the DeSantis administration would look at these verified signatures, right? One supervisor of elections told us that it was unprecedented in her time at doing her job and filling this role.
Well, so that's one step in this story is that they're looking at these forms. They're kind of asking to examine these petition signatures. But you and your group also found out that it goes even further, where there are law enforcement officers from the state of Florida visiting people in their homes about this. What do we know?
Yeah, so basically the day after that story about them going to these different counties asking for all these petitions, we started hearing rumblings, and I think the first thing we saw was on social media of a person posting on this group publicly saying that officer, basically without any kind of visible identification, so a plainclothes officer, showed up to his house, asked him about the validity of his petition signature, and that he said, yeah, I did sign that. And he told the officer that it was his valid signature. At one point, he asked for the officer's badge number, but when we talked to him, he couldn't remember it. And so, but when we did reach out to him, he was very like shaken. He said that it was something that kind of threw him off. Like he couldn't understand why they would show up to his house like that. And then there ended up being another resident of Lee County where that man lived who had experienced something similar, but they were looking for her family member. And then she was standing there while the officer questioned the family member. And then that time the officer gave her a card. And that card said that he was with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the Election Crimes Unit. So then I was able to, call him. He referred me to FDLE for comment. I ended up getting a comment from the Department of State where they essentially confirmed that they were doing this. And then we got that story out, and that story went absolutely, wild across the country. People were carrying it and talking about it. And now it's become a big topic of conversation. And since then, actually, DeSantis has defended the actions that just happened yesterday during a press conference where he defended the actions of the police showing up at the doors and gathering all these signatures. Meanwhile, the Democrats were kind of blasting him and criticizing him for doing this.
Yeah, we have a clip of DeSantis defending that. And I just want to remind people that our guest is Justin Garcia, the state and local accountability reporter for the Tampa Bay Times, who also looks into election integrity. We're talking about the Times' recent reporting on law enforcement showing up at the homes of people who signed a petition to get Amendment 4 on the ballot. This is Tuesday Cafe. We're broadcasting from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. I'm Sean Canan. So here is what DeSantis said at a press conference yesterday when he was asked about this story that Justin is telling you about.
Anyone who submitted a petition accurately that's a valid voter is totally within their rights to do it. They're not investigating that. What they're investigating is fraudulent petitions. They're investigating. I mean, we know that this group did submit on behalf of dead people. And I don't know how you do that. I mean, I thought that was a Chicago thing, but yet they did it here, right? And so we know that. And then you also know that there are documented examples, which FDLE is looking at, where the petition and the name does not match the signature that's on file. And that's just the reality. So the question is that a valid signature or not? And it may be that the signature is totally different, and that voter will say, no, I actually did do that. Maybe they signed their name. That is absolutely possible. And if that's what you say, I think that's probably the end of it. But I do think that they've identified examples that are not valid, and they absolutely need to be. Anyone that is trying to commit fraud in this process absolutely should be held accountable. And what I found is if people know that there's accountability, then it really deters others from wanting to do it in the future.
And the governor went on after that. I was going to play a longer clip, but honestly, he just went on and on and on about a whole bunch of things that I don't know how it was related to that question he started to talk about. And I'm going to point this out because it might be kind of a preview of what we might hear in the debate tonight. It sounded like a lot of kind of scare tactics talking points. Governor DeSantis, I mean, he was asked about cops showing up at the voter doors of Florida voters, and he started talking about Haitians in Ohio and open borders and non-U.S. citizens voting in city elections in some cities. I mean, he really went on, and it kind of, I think it might be a preview of what we might hear from Donald Trump tonight about some of the scare tactic issues. But going away from that, going back to the Florida story, Justin, anything that the governor said there that jumps out at you?
Well, what it seems like to me and some of my fellow reporters is that he's kind of blurring the lines there when he talks about issues with petition signatures. Those were found during the normal process of verifying the signatures, right? And those happen sometimes, and you just double check, and that's why they have that process to make sure and kind of weed things out. That already happened. He's not addressing the people who are being approached to sign their valid, verified signature, and they're being approached by police. He kind of sidestepped that question completely and then started talking about something different. And so that's the important part to keep in mind here is, keeping an eye on if they're actually answering the question directly or not is really important in an instance like that. And it just, the issue here is definitely, also transparency. And that's why we're going to keep digging into this and keeping an eye on how many counties this is spreading to. We do encourage anybody who has been, approached by police at their door about their ballot petition signature to reach out to us. We're also trying to keep an eye on, what other supervisor of elections offices are being approached about reviewing these thousands of petition signatures. So we'll be keeping our ears to the ground for sure. And I hope the community does reach out if this is spreading to other counties.
Yeah, our guest is Justin Garcia, the state and local accountability reporter for the Tampa Bay Times. So I want to ask you if there's anything else about this story that we should know about. And if not, we can jump into some of your other local reporting about jails. Is there something else we should know about this?
Just that we will be still on top of it. We will be following it. This obviously isn't going away, right? It seems like one thing that's becoming apparent is the state is throwing its full force behind standing against that amendment passing. And so this is going to be kind of a long couple months till November, and we'll see how the cards fall and what happens there. But as far as other local reporting, yeah, there was another story I did recently about jails being overfull in Tampa Bay and people sleeping on floor beds in the Pinellas County Jail. Hundreds of people are sleeping on beds that are on the floor, held up by these little plastic frames. And the sheriff over there and also the Hillsborough sheriff said that at least part of the reason is because of a bail law that passed earlier this year that makes it more difficult for people to be released on their own recognizance until their court date. It can also allow judges to set the bond higher than before, but if they wanted to lower the bond, they would have to get approval from the Supreme Court. So it's led to this kind of situation where in Pinellas especially, they only have one jail, right? And they don't have room to build another one or plans to build another one. So they're seeing people in there for DUI, for criminal mischief, for these for trespassing, for these minor nonviolent misdemeanors, and they're getting stuck in there for sometimes months because of this bail law. And in the story I did a few weeks ago, even one of the people who helped craft the law and pass it into law, she was saying that they need to the reps that passed it need to look at it again, perhaps, and kind of review the law and see how they can address this problem, whereas keeping these people who are nonviolent, apparently, and seemingly not a threat to society, being trapped in jail until their court date.
So what kind of fix might happen? Did the state representative mention what they might try to fix?
No, not directly. I have to follow up with her actually. I meant to. With stories like that, you always want to like follow up a couple weeks later, but then I immediately start getting pulled into all this other madness. And so I definitely want to follow up with her soon, and just to keep an eye on where the movement is there, because it really is not, according to Pinellas Sheriff Bob Gualtieri and others, it's just not sustainable. Eventually you're going to not have enough room, and even now technically there isn't enough room. They're just making more, so and that also puts a strain on staffing, on resources. It also costs taxpayers a lot of money. It costs I think the number was like $157 per day per person in jail in Pinellas County. And so when you have hundreds more in there than there normally would be, that adds up over the month, right? So there's a multi-level effect to this. So I will be following up on that. Sorry, I don't have other follow-up details on it now. I've just been pulled in a bunch of different directions. So
yeah, well, we look forward to hearing about your reporting on that, and also the reporting on the story about Amendment 4 and other election stories. So I want to thank you so much for coming on Tuesday Cafe today, Justin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Justin Garcia is the Tampa Bay Times state and local accountability reporter with a focus on law enforcement and the judicial system, and he's also looking at election integrity. And we've been speaking about elections police in Florida visiting the homes of petition signers. And if you missed any of this interview, you can watch it later today on WMNF.org. This is Tuesday Cafe. We're broadcasting from the studios of WMNF Tampa. And the rest of the show, we're going to let you hear about a new program that we are going to be bringing you soon when we unveil our new revamped schedule on WMNF's HD3, The Source. You can listen to The Source on an HD radio. It's at 88.5 HD3. You can also listen on the WMNF app or on WMNF.org. The Source is a 24-hour-a-day news and public affairs channel, and a lot of your favorites on The Source are staying in place. For example, Tom Hartman is live from noon to 3 every weekday afternoon. And Democracy Now! Is live at 8 in the morning and then replayed at 5 in the afternoon every weekday. We also bring you Fresh Air every weekday. And we're going to bring you some shows that are brand new to The Source. So check this one out. It's called Living on Earth. And I hope you think it's worth keeping on The Source, worth bringing onto The Source. If you have any comments, email us at dj@wmnf.org. This first segment on Living on Earth is about solar power. This is WMNF Tampa.
Public lands in the United States have historically been used for a variety of purposes, ranging from wildlife habitat to recreation to fossil fuel development. In fact, as of 2022, about 23 million acres of public lands were under lease for oil and gas extraction. But public lands are also important for building out renewable energy, like solar. And the Federal Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, the largest landowner in the country, is now in the process of bringing its plans to develop solar energy in the western U.S. up to date. So this August, BLM released a proposal for how it would update this Western solar plan, which is expected to be finalized by the end of the year. The update earmarks around 32 million acres for possible solar development. Greg DeBee is a senior staff attorney for the Wilderness Society, and he's here to walk us through what this new plan might mean for the West. Welcome to Living on Earth, Greg.
Thank you. Great to be here, Ainsley.
Greg, from what I understand, the Bureau of Land Management first wrote a plan for Western solar development way back in 2012. And this proposal seeks to update that plan. So what major changes to solar development in the West are being proposed with this?
Yeah, I'd say right off the top, the biggest change is BLM is broadening the geographic scope of the plan. The original 2012 plan created a blueprint for solar development in the 6 southwestern states, which at that time was where most solar development was expected to occur. So California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada, and Colorado. New technologies such as photovoltaic panel technology, which converts sunlight directly into energy, has really taken the place of the old technology in 2012, which was concentrated solar farms. And that old technology required more sunlight. It required flatter land. So BLM at the time really just focused on the 6 southwestern states where most of the sun was and most of the flatter land was. Now that there is new technologies, BLM determined that it needed to expand the plan to cover the Northern Rockies states and the Pacific Northwestern states as well. So Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, Oregon. Previously, solar development could still occur in those 5 other states, but it was happening in a more ad hoc fashion and without the guidance that's set forth in this plan.
And what is the sort of goal of these updates? You know, what is the Bureau of Land Management really hoping to accomplish here?
From my perspective, based on what BLM has indicated in the plan itself and from its public statements, BLM, for one, is responding to the clean energy goals set by Congress in the Energy Act of 2020 and in various executive orders issued by the Biden administration. Those goals are 25 gigawatts of clean energy on public lands by 2025, which BLM has already met and surpassed that goal earlier this year. And then there's a goal of a carbon-free electricity sector by 2035 and net zero emissions economy by 2050. So there's a lot of work to do to accomplish those last 2 goals. And this updated solar plan hopefully will help put us on the path to a clean energy transition. And then, just generally speaking, the primary goal of the plan is really just to determine which lands should be open or closed to solar applications based on the presence of resource conflicts, the concerns of local communities and tribal nations, and just to determine where solar is not appropriate and where it might be suitable.
So walk me through this term, previously disturbed land. What does that mean in this context?
Yeah, previously disturbed. It's a little bit of a vague concept, and the way it's laid out in the plan is a little wonky. But BLM considers lands to be previously disturbed where the soils or the vegetation have been altered from historical reference conditions. So where humans have caused a disturbance on the land. So think roads, buildings, and other infrastructure. And the question of previously disturbed lands is important, and it arises here because BLM identified lands as available to solar application if they are either within 15 miles of existing or planned transmission lines, or if they're outside that 15-mile buffer, if a solar application is on what qualifies as previously disturbed lands, then BLM will accept and process that application and consider whether to approve or deny that project.
So it sounds like the idea is to steer projects away from a sort of pristine habitat. In what other ways does the proposal account for wilderness and wildlife protection?
Yeah, a plan of this size covering 11 states can never be perfect, and no plan of this size and scope ever is. But we do think it's a critical first step that BLM needed to undertake to help the transition to a clean energy economy. And we do think BLM did some things right to protect wildlife and wilderness and public lands generally. Right off the bat, the plan prohibits solar development on over 130 million acres of the most important public lands that the agency knew immediately would never be suitable for utility scale solar development. So places like monuments and wilderness areas, critical habitat, etc., are excluded from solar development. And then, more specifically, BLM did things to protect wildlife migration corridors, which are critical for biodiversity and the long-term health of wildlife populations. They're essential for subsistence lifestyles and recreational economies in Western communities. BLM also worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service to map specific areas that are important to about 40 specific species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. So it identified, for example, important habitat connectivity lands for the Mojave Desert tortoise. And now we're committed to ensuring that BLM successfully implements the solar plan in a manner that avoids the most conflicts and addresses the concerns of local communities and tribal nations.
So, Greg, if you tally it all up, there's something like 160 million acres of public lands that are managed by BLM across these 11 Western states. And this plan takes about, 32 million of those acres and leaves them open to solar development. But that still sounds like a lot to me. I mean, I can't imagine that that's all going to be chock-a-block full of solar projects. So how much of that land is BLM expecting to actually be developed for these solar projects?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. This is really important. Of course, the 32 million acre figure grabs the headlines, and it's shocking when you first see that number. But it's important to realize that not all of those lands will be covered in solar panels. So BLM looked at a couple studies from the Department of Energy and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to estimate that only about 700,000 acres, and that's still a large amount. But again, remember, this is spread out over 11 Western states. About 700,000 acres of lands will be needed to meet our solar energy needs by the year 2045. So about 20 years from now. And this 700,000 acres represents barely 2% of the 32 million acres that BLM has determined might be suitable for solar development. So 98% of these lands, even under an aggressive build-out scenario, will not be developed with solar projects.
Greg, why is this update so important? What is going to come out of it?
So climate change is the most pressing environmental and social justice issue of our time. We think the science is unequivocal that greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change effects and that immediate action is necessary to avert the worst impacts. And public lands offer some of the best renewable energy sources to allow us to quickly transition to a clean energy economy. Using the formula that BLM relies on, these 700,000 acres could potentially support over 93,000 megawatts of solar power, or 93 gigawatts. This is enough to power tens of millions of homes. I think it's over 30 million homes or so. So we would still need a mix of other renewable energy sources like wind and geothermal and others, but this plan will go a long way to meeting our clean energy goals. We think it's a thoughtful, comprehensive plan that is consistent with what we call a smart from the start approach to renewable energy development, where careful, thoughtful planning that considers the input of local communities and tribes in the beginning will lead to faster deployment of solar energy in the end.
Greg DeBee is a senior staff attorney for the Wilderness Society. Greg, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
Well, that was a segment from the program called Living on Earth, which is going to be a weekly show on WMNF's HD3, The Source. And we're going to unveil our new schedule in the coming weeks, and it's going to be exciting. I hope that you get to listen to HD3 and enjoy it. Here's how you can listen to HD3, The Source. You can go to, if you have an HD radio, you can go to 88.5 HD3. You can also listen on the WMNF app or you can listen on WMNF.org. And it's a 24-hour-a-day news and public affairs channel. Some of your favorites are on it already, like Tom Hartman live from noon to 3 every weekday afternoon, Democracy Now! Live at 8 in the morning, and replayed at 5 in the afternoon every weekday. We also have Fresh Air and so on. Let me read a couple of emails quickly before we move to the next segment of Living on Earth. John writes in, I'm not sure if Justin mentioned it, but he and I discussed the statute that says it's too late to challenge those petitions, so the whole thing is pointless, says John out there in cyberspace. And Bubba writes, I'm tuning in a little late, but Florida election police seem like a Gestapo tactic. And he says that DeSantis is acting like a nasty little Nazi. And then Alexander writes, how many people think that going to things like Pride and other festivals where people are drinking and maybe drunk and are being asked to sign these petitions and that the signature will more than likely not match the signature on file? Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because all my understanding and how Justin explained it to us as well is that these are signatures that have already been verified and accepted. So, things like signature matches isn't even really what the governor's office is kind of getting at. And as John pointed out, there's no way to challenge it at this point anyway. So, yeah, good point. What is even the purpose of this whole show? Perhaps would be a good one way to ask about it. Well, let's hear some more of Living on Earth. This one is about what are the environmental and climate policies of one of the vice presidential picks, Tim Walz. So we'll hear this segment. And again, you're listening to Tuesday Cafe, but we're previewing the show called Living on Earth, which is going to be in our HD3 lineup when we make some changes in a few weeks.
Jenny, as you know, alongside Democratic nominee Kamala Harris is her running mate Tim Walz. And all eyes have been on him and his record in the month or so since he was tapped as vice presidential candidate.
Yeah, Ainsley, Walz has been Minnesota's governor since 2019. And for over a decade before that, he represented the state's historically red 1st District as a Democrat.
And I think he's also pretty famous for giving off this sort of Midwestern dad, everyman energy.
That's right. He was a high school social studies teacher, a football coach, and he served in the National Guard. So yeah, I would say Coach Walz fits the bill.
But putting his Midwestern dad credentials aside, we're here to take a look at his record on climate and environment with journalist Christopher Teig from our media partner Inside Climate News.
And Christopher joins us from Minnesota. Welcome to Living on Earth.
Hi, Jenny and Ainsley. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with Tim Walz's time as governor. What's his reputation there?
Well, Walz is considered a climate champion among advocates for the progressive policies he passed in this state, including a 2023 bill he signed that requires Minnesota utilities to produce 100% of their electricity from carbon-free sources by 2040. He made a point of mentioning that climate win in his State of the State speech earlier this year.
We struck a blow against climate change, putting Minnesota on a path to 100% clean energy by 2040 and leading the nation.
Now, that law is on par with those in states that have traditionally led on climate action, like California and New York. He also signed a bill that same year that was compared to the Inflation Reduction Act for its investments in a green future.
What kind of investments would those be?
The act invested around $2 billion into rebates for electric vehicles and heat pumps, incentives for schools to install solar, and funding for habitat restoration. It also created regulations for PFAS, or forever chemicals, and initiated efforts to improve agricultural practices. Governor Walz also signed legislation to streamline clean energy development that supporters say will shave about 9 months off the whole process.
Wow, infrastructure, EVs, clean energy, that does sound a lot like the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, Christopher, since Walz is from the Midwest, what kind of relationship with the ag industry does he have?
Yeah, it's a good question. Agriculture is a huge deal in the Midwest, which produces about a quarter of the nation's food each year. And Walz is friendly with the ag industry, to say the least, both big ag and small-scale farmers alike. When he was in Congress, Walz served on the Agriculture Committee, where he supported bills that helped small-scale farmers compete with factory farms and incentivized farmers to adopt regenerative practices that improved soil health. Now, that's good for climate since it allows the land to absorb more carbon dioxide.
Yeah, we heard similar things from Sean Carroll of the Minnesota-based Land Stewardship Project. He says Walz has carried similar policies forward into the Minnesota State House.
As governor in Minnesota, Governor Walz and our legislature have put historic investments into soil health programs, creating an emerging farmer office, developing a down payment assistance program to help farmers buy land. And these are policies that address the root systemic change we need in agriculture. Keep more farmers on the land and allow the farmers who are stewarding the land to earn a fair wage for their work.
And of course, Walz understands that connection between ag and climate. Here he is in 2020.
Everybody wants that better future for their children. Everybody, I think, wants to lead something that they can be proud of. And I think it's going back to finding those sweet spots. For example, around climate change. As again, I said, I represented one of the largest agricultural districts, number 2 in pork production, number 2 in turkeys, all of those things that you would think are associated with rural America, and that there might not be that emphasis. These are people that are deeply connected to their land, deeply concerned about sustainability. So when I first went to Congress and started talking about addressing climate change, while yes, it's an existential threat, was also an incredible economic driver and a legacy issue for our children.
Well, and Governor Walz has gotten a lot of press for his efforts to use those Midwestern food resources to improve the lives of children now. He's supported farm-to-school programs, and in 2023, he signed into law a free school breakfast and lunch guarantee.
Yeah, but Jenny, there's a flip side to the ag industry support as well. Environmentalists have criticized Walz for his support of ethanol, which is a corn-based fuel that's added to gasoline. 40% of America's corn goes to producing ethanol. Supporters say it's more environmentally friendly than gasoline alone, but some research has shown otherwise. So many climate activists believe ethanol isn't good for the environment at all, and similarly to fossil fuels, needs to be phased out. But Walz has never asserted such a thing, and it seems unlikely he would.
Okay, sounds like he's walking a fine line there.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Christopher, aside from agriculture issues, what other pushback has Walz received about his record?
Sure. Many climate activists and indigenous groups have criticized Walz for supporting tar sands oil pipelines. Specifically, he supported the Keystone XL pipeline as a congressman, and as governor, he allowed the completion of the Line 3 pipeline, which runs from Canada to Wisconsin by way of Minnesota.
Yeah, both pretty controversial pipelines. So, Christopher, what does all this mean for the future of the Democratic Party? What kinds of policy actions in terms of agriculture and environment is a Harris-Walz administration likely to take if they win this November?
Well, it's hard to say, but it's certainly strategically important for Harris to have a vice president who can connect with the needs of rural America while also pushing for strong climate policies, both in agriculture and beyond. Like Biden in his last 2 years, we're seeing Harris take a more moderate approach to climate change policy. Remember that as a presidential candidate in 2020, she supported banning fracking, but has since switched her position. Walz walks that line too, especially when it comes to his support of certain fossil fuel infrastructure and the ag industry. For now, it appears that the two are adopting the platform Biden was running on, and both Harris and Walz have refrained from mentioning climate policy in their public appearances since the start of their campaign together.
Yeah, I know that when the spotlight was on Walz at the Democratic National Convention, I was crossing my fingers for a mention of climate or environment in his speech, but we didn't get too lucky there, did we?
Yeah, that's right. That was a bit of a theme for this year's DNC. The environment only really made an appearance in the speech once, when Walz was criticizing his opponents.
When Republicans use the word freedom, they mean that the government should be free to invade your doctor's office. Corporations free to pollute your air and water. And banks free to take advantage of customers. But when we Democrats talk about freedom, we mean the freedom to make a better life for yourself and the people that you love.
His speech was really more pep than policy, complete with several of his former football players appearing on stage to cheer him on. And it's been pretty similar messaging since the convention wrapped up, which is not much. But still, top Democrats seem to be okay with this. Jay Inslee, the Democratic governor of Washington and a well-known climate hawk, told the New York Times that he doesn't mind that Harris and Walz are refraining from speaking about climate change, Those Democrats believe it's more important to draw a distinction between a Harris-Walz ticket and a second term for former President Trump.
Well, we'll be eager to see what else we hear on climate and environment from the Harris-Walz campaign in these very short weeks before the election.
Christopher Teig is a journalist with our media partner, Inside Climate News. Christopher, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Christopher.
Thank you both.
Well, that was a segment from Living on Earth, which will be in the new HD3, the Source lineup on WMNF's HD3. Let's hear another segment here at the end of the show about methane gas production.
Rooftop solar, weatherization, and efficient appliances can lower the overall carbon footprint of homes and even make them zero net energy, meaning they produce as much or more energy than they use. And local affiliates of the nonprofit Habitat for Humanity are building such homes intended to give people affordable housing while also helping the planet. But appliances powered by fossil fuels are being installed in some of these homes, canceling out many of the climate benefits and potentially harming the health of the people living there. Darna Noor reported on this for The Guardian and joins me now. Welcome to Living on Earth.
Thanks so much for having me. It's exciting to be here.
What are zero net energy homes, and how do the homes featured in your investigation claim to qualify?
Yeah, it's interesting. So zero net energy homes are essentially supposed to be homes that create more power than they use. So in this case, they're homes that are outfitted with solar panels on their roofs. They're meticulously sort of weatherized and insulated to ensure that no unnecessary energy is being used to boost efficiency. But the actual appliances in the homes can be powered by anything in zero net energy homes. And in the story that I wrote about the case of utilities partnering with Habitat for Humanity chapters, it's actually gas that is powering many of these appliances, such as stoves and furnaces and water heaters.
So how realistic is the expectation that these homes can actually achieve zero net energy use when gas is being used in these homes?
So, yeah, it's a great question. And there's sort of two issues here. One of them is that, as you're sort of suggesting, there is some evidence that in at least one case, one of these so-called dual fuel homes, that's a home that runs on gas for appliances, but also is outfitted with solar panels, was not meeting that benchmark, but a fully electric one in the same sort of region was. That said, there are certainly homes that have gas appliances in them that are meeting the zero net energy benchmark. But the bigger issue here is that even if they are producing more energy than they're using, they're still producing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, planet warming pollution. So simply producing power from solar panels on your rooftop does not actually cancel out the emissions from, say, your furnace or your stove if they run on gas. And there's another thing at play here too, which is that placing gas in homes is not only itself a source of emissions, but it actually sort of gives an excuse to continue producing gas, pulling it out of the ground, extracting it, sending it through pipelines, distributing it to homes. And homes that purport to be zero net energy, even if they do meet that benchmark, if they run with gas in them, they can sort of give city officials a message that, hey, we actually need to keep producing this planet heating fossil fuel to ensure that, people have access to cooking appliances and warm air and warm water and things like this. So while some of them actually do meet the benchmark, there are some bigger issues at play, I guess I'd say.
So proponents of gas will say it is cleaner burning than, for example, like an oil-powered furnace, which I used to have in an apartment. But what are the concerns when it comes to the emissions that can be produced from gas in homes?
Yeah, the question of how clean gas is relative to other fossil fuels sort of depends who you ask, I guess. Industry interests have long claimed that gas is cleaner than oil and coal, the other sort of main fossil fuels that we use. There's some evidence for that, but then there's other evidence that actually shows that if you take the methane emissions into account, it's actually more planet warming than coal from sort of extraction to use. So natural gas, as it's called by industry interests, is actually mostly made of methane, and that's a planet heating gas that is actually 80 times more planet warming than carbon dioxide in the short term. So it's a pretty huge sort of contributor to fossil fuel use and to greenhouse gas emissions. So again, sort of depends who you ask how clean it is, but I think there's plenty of evidence that shows that industry interests have certainly been calling it a clean fuel when in fact experts are very, very concerned about not only its effects on the climate, but also its effects on human health.
So explain, please, why some climate advocates are saying that this practice of putting gas into these so-called zero net energy homes, that this is a big public relations stunt. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it's something where I think the concerns of some of these climate advocates really bore out in my research. So I talked to a guy named Itai Vardi. He works at the sort of watchdog group called Energy and Policy Institute that's really pro-electrification. And he basically said that the project of installing these so-called zero-net energy homes with Habitat for Humanity chapters by gas utilities, he said this project is a cynical PR stunt. And in fact, that seems like it was not just a sort of vibes-based analysis. I actually was able to obtain industry webinar recordings and other sort of internal documents that showed that is basically the case. You know, during this one webinar that I watched from last year, there was a representative from the utility Atmos Energy that's created these zero net energy homes with Habitat chapters all over the US. And they said that these projects actually began as a response to the attempts to get gas out of buildings. So the first one of these projects was in Colorado, and he said, and this is a direct quote, in Colorado, they are a little bit on the front lines as far as some of the efforts to maybe dissuade people from utilizing natural gas. And as such, that became the chosen site for our very first natural gas ZNE, that's zero net energy home build. So essentially what he's saying here is, hey, in Colorado, they're actually like getting some support to try to get gas out of homes. And so we put this here intentionally to try to combat those efforts.
By the way, Darna, where are these homes being built?
So these homes are in a lot of different places. Atmos Energy, which is a gas utility, launched the project again in Colorado in September 2021, and it's since expanded it to a bunch of different places: Kentucky, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Tennessee. And it also has new plans now to launch similar initiatives in Virginia and Kansas. And then there's a couple other utilities that have used a sort of similar model. There's National Fuel that operates in the Northeast. And then there's SoCal Gas, which operates, of course, in Southern California. Nicor, which is another gas utility that operates specifically in Illinois, has also partnered with Habitat on zero net energy projects. So really, these are pretty pervasive in lots of different parts of the country.
Now, Darna, there are studies that we've reported on Living on Earth that link gas stoves to poor indoor air quality and problems like asthma.
Yes.
To what extent do you think that those health impacts might be especially harmful for the low-income and minority communities that this affordable housing is being built for?
Yeah, this is such a good question, and it's something that really sort of concerned me when I learned about these projects. Experts have been warning for a really long time that gas appliances emit lots of toxic pollutants, including carcinogens. And as you're sort of saying, a recent slew of studies has linked gas stoves to specifically increased risk of childhood asthma, as well as, things like chronic lung disease and a bunch of other health impacts. And you're right in sort of wondering about the specific effects on low-income people. There's plenty of research that shows that low-income people and people of color specifically may be at higher risk if they're exposed to these sort of toxins in their homes, because they might be more likely to have asthma and underlying respiratory issues already due to the sort of disproportionate exposure to environmental contaminants that we see in this country based on a very racist history of things like redlining and the way that highways have been built and things like this. So it's a way that I think this project sort of, you might say, adds insult to injury. Not only is it low-income people who are being used as the sort of excuse to place more gas in homes, but they themselves, via these projects, may also be getting exposed to harmful pollutants that could really harm their health and their children's health.
Darna, I understand that there are some fully electric homes that Habitat for Humanity is building.
There are.
So to what extent could those serve as a model for future projects?
Yeah, this is part of what's so interesting about the sort of Habitat model here. I spoke with Habitat International, and they said that they're certainly concerned about climate change. They purport to be a sort of climate leader, but they also said that they sort of leave it up to individual Habitat chapters to decide what kinds of projects they're going to embark on and how they get their funding. But Habitat for Humanity's affiliate in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, actually did build all-electric homes in partnership with a public utility in Cape Cod. And in 2021, it was actually rated the best-rated Habitat home in the nation in terms of efficiency. Another Habitat affiliate in Massachusetts actually built another all-electric zero-net energy home that won praise from the federal government. They did not partner with a utility. And actually, this year, the federal government announced $2 billion for a coalition of nonprofits, including Habitat for Humanity International and some sort of climate-focused nonprofits. So in essence, while there are Habitat chapters that are partnering with gas utilities to put more gas into low-income homes, Habitat International is actually embarking on this project to spend lots of money to build fully electric low-income housing. So certainly I think that provides a lot more evidence that we don't really need to put polluting fuels like gas in homes in order to ensure that people can afford them.
So looking at the big picture here, how important is safe and affordable climate-controlled housing in a world where extreme heat is creating dangerous conditions in cities?
Yeah, I mean, affordable housing is absolutely of complete paramount importance, especially at a time when the climate crisis is getting so much worse. We see, for instance, that low-income homes are often more likely to be built in floodplains, the heat island effect, which means that places that have a lot of asphalt and paved areas kind of soak in more heat. That effect can mean that low-income people are much, much more exposed to dangerous temperatures. And also, affordable housing can often be the housing that is kind of not kept up with very well. It can often be left to deteriorate. And that means that it's often much less efficient than housing that, sort of wealthier people are able to live in. So it's really, really important to have affordable housing and also climate safe housing. And obviously, I applaud efforts to get people into safe, affordable homes. Again, though, just would venture to say that there's no reason to pit the interests of people in having affordable homes against the interest of people in having a livable climate, especially when there's tons and tons and tons of research, just mounds of research that show that low-income people in the US and elsewhere are more vulnerable to the effects of the climate crisis.
Darna Noor is the fossil fuels and climate reporter for The Guardian US. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Just a note on the comparison of methane versus carbon dioxide when it comes to how much they warm the planet. When methane is burned in a gas stove or furnace, most of it is converted to carbon dioxide, so it counts the same as any other molecule of CO2. Still, some of it does leak into the atmosphere between when it's extracted and when it makes it to your stove, and that's where the 80 times potency difference comes into effect. Finally, when asked about its policy on gas in homes, Habitat for Humanity International provided a statement that reads in part, Habitat International and our diverse network of Habitat affiliates and organizations, each an independent local nonprofit, rely on a wide range of partners and home energy sources to help increase access to safe, decent, and affordable shelter. Some of those partnerships, including those cited in the Guardian article, seek climate change solutions related to housing, and Habitat organizations continue to evaluate which ones are most effective. You can read the full statement on the Living on Earth website, loe.org.
Well, that was Living on Earth, which will be a new show on our HD3 channel, The Source. And I want to thank my earlier guest, Justin Garcia from the Tampa Bay Times. If you missed that interview, you can watch it on WMNF.org later today. This has been WMNF's Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Canan. We have a special show next week hosted by Megan Bowman and Chris Young next week on Tuesday Cafe. During this time slot tomorrow, Shelley will host Midpoint at 10 on Wednesday. Coming up next is Wavemakers with Janet and Tom Scherberger. They're going to have a couple of topics. They're going to speak with a state house candidate, Ashley Brundage, and also with the Tampa Bay Butterfly Foundation about pesticide-free gardening. Coming up at noon is Wide Awake America with Nadine Smith. She will dive into one of the most dangerous threats to democracy, Project 2025. The 925-page blueprint is an extremist vision to dismantle civil liberties, reshape the government, and strip away protections for LGBTQ plus rights, reproductive freedoms, and more. Nadine will interview Anne Christine Didaski, founder of Stop the Coup Project 2025, which has been on the front lines exposing this chilling plan. Then, at 1 o'clock is The Scoop, WMNF's 5-minute summary of the day's headlines. This has been Tuesday Cafe, coming to you live on September 10th, 2024, from the studios of WMNF Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota, and Lakeland. Thanks so much to everyone who donated. Marguerite Longoria from Tampa just donated $100 and supports the morning show Tuesday. WMNF Tampa.